List of Guggenheim Fellowships awarded in 1960. List of Guggenheim Fellowships awarded in 1960. 1960 U.S. and Canadian Fellows. Ursula Helen Knight Abbott, Professor of Avian Sciences, University of California. Henry David Aiken, deceased, Philosophy, 1960. Robert Day Allen, deceased, Biology, 1960-1965. Harold Altman, artist, Lamont, Pennsylvania, 1960. 1961. In 61, 61. 1961. 61. 61. 61. 61. 61. 1961. James Leroy Anderson, Professor of Physics, Stevens Institute of Technology, 1960. David Aronson, painter, Emeritus Professor of Art, Boston University, 1960. John W. Atkinson, Professor Emeritus of Psychology, University of Michigan, 1960. Peter L. R., Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and Director. Juan Bautista Abel Arce Jose Miguel Barrandiaran, Professor of Basque Studies, University of California, Santa Barbara, 1960. Milton Babbitt, composer Henry Shoebale Conant, Professor Emeritus of Music, Princeton University, member of the faculty, the Juilliard School, 1960. Richard McLean Badger, deceased, Chemistry, 1960. 1960. Louis Coombs Weller Baker, Professor Emeritus of Chemistry, Georgetown University, 1960. John W. Baldwin, Charles Homer Haskins, Professor of History, the Johns Hopkins University, 1960-1983. Ernest Aubrey Ball, deceased, Biology Plant Science, 1960. Paul Walden Bamford, Emeritus Professor of History, University of Minnesota, 1960. William Alvin Baum, Research Professor Emeritus of Astronomy, University of Washington, Seattle, 1960. George Bernard Benedek, Alfred H. Caspary, Professor of Physics and Biological Physics, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1960. John Berry, writer, Los Angeles, 1960. George Athenbilius, Professor of American History, Clark University, 1960. James H. Billington, the Librarian of Congress, Washington, D.C., 1960. Robert W. Burge, Associate Director Emeritus, Physics Division, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, University of California, Berkeley, 1960. Z. William Birnbaum, Professor Emeritus of Mathematics, University of Washington, 1960. Harold H. Biswell, deceased, Biology Plant Science, 1960. Donald S. Bloom, painter, retired art educator, Piscataway Schools, New Jersey, 1960. Richard Mitchell Bohart, Professor Emeritus of Entomology, University of California, Davis, 1960. Bradford Allen Booth, deceased, 19th century English literature, 1960. William Francis Brace, Professor of Geology, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1960. Howard Bradford, graphic artist and painter, Monterey, California, 1960. Theodore W. Bretz, deceased, Biology Plant Science, 1960. Barry Shelley Brooke, deceased, Music Research, 1966. France R. Bratson, Stanley C. Moore, Professor Emeritus, Rice University, 1960. Frank Edward Brown, deceased, Classics, 1960. Jean Adam Brucker, Shepard Professor Emeritus of History, University of California, Berkeley, 1960. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Counselor, Center for Strategic and International Studies, thesis, 1960. Byron Burford, painter, Professor of Art, University of Iowa, 1960. John W. Kahn, Senior NIST Fellow, National Institute of Standards and Technology, Adjunct Professor of Materials Science, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1960. James E. Canwright, Professor Emeritus of Botany, Arizona State University, 1960. Hollis B. Chenery, deceased, Economics, 1960. David Kuhn Cheng, Centennial Professor Emeritus of Electrical Engineering, Syracuse University, 1960. Paul A. Clement, deceased, Classics, 1960. Henning Cohen, deceased, American Literature, 1960. Marshall H. Cohen, Professor Emeritus, Law Center, University of Southern California, 1960-1980, C. 1980, 1880, C. 1980, E. 1980, 1880. Germaine Cohen-Bazoyer, Retired Director of Research, Pasteur Institute, Paris, 1960. Acastanier Germain. Henry Steele Comidger, deceased, U.S. History, 1960. Jane Marvel Cooper, poet, New York City, Professor Emeritus, Sarah Lawrence College, 1960. William David Davies, George Washington Ivey Professor Emeritus of Advanced Studies and Research in Christian Origins, Duke University, Visiting Distinguished University Professor, and holder of the Bradford Chair in Religion Studies, Texas Christian University, 1960-1966. Herbert Andrew Dean, deceased, Political Science, 1960. André Jacques de Bethune, Professor Emeritus of Chemistry, Boston College, 1960. Philip Howard de Lacy, Professor Emeritus of Classical Studies, University of Pennsylvania, 1960. Raul Alfredo del Piro, deceased, Spanish, 1960. Vincent P. DeSantis, Professor Emeritus of History, University of Notre Dame, 1960. Albert Henry Detweiler, deceased, Architecture, 1960. Ernest Stanley Dodge, deceased, Anthropology, 1960. Leonard W. Dube, deceased, Psychology, 1960. Daniel Charles Drucker, Graduate Research Professor Emeritus of Engineering Sciences, University of Florida, 1960. Philip Calvin Durham, deceased, American Literature, 1960. Leonard Edmondson, printmaker, Professor of Printmaking, Otis Art Institute of Los Angeles County, 1960. Robert Martin Iceberg, Professor of Physics, University of California, Santa Barbara, 1960. Alexander Elliott, writer, Venice, California, 1960. Howard Tasker Evans, Jr., Scientist Emeritus, U.S. Geological Survey, Reston, Virginia, 1960. Paul P. Ewald, deceased, Physics, 1960. Charles Fairman, deceased, Law, 1960. Sampson Lane Faison, Jr., Amos Lawrence, Professor Emeritus of Art, Williams College, 1960. Alan Judson Fowler, Research Professor, Institute of Fluid Dynamics and Applied Mathematics, University of Maryland, College Park, 1960. Eldon Earl Ferguson, Retired Director, Climate Monitoring and Diagnostics Laboratory, Boulder, Colorado, 1960. George Brooks Field, Robert Wheeler Wilson Professor of Applied Astronomy, Harvard University, 1960. Wesley Robert Fischel, deceased, Political Science, 1960. Walter D. Fisher, deceased, Economics, 1960. William Batch of Fretter, deceased, Physics, 1960. Morton Fried, deceased, Anthropology, 1960. Ilias Friedensohn, deceased, Fine Arts, 1960. Lee Friedlander, photographer, New City, New York, 1960, 1962, 1977. Jean Garrigue, deceased, Poetry, 1960. Ignace Gelb, deceased, Near Eastern Studies, 1960. Khalil Gibran, deceased, Sculptor, Boston, Massachusetts, 19,591,960. Langdon Brown Gilkey, Professor of Theology, University of Chicago Divinity School, 1960, 1965. James Galooly, deceased, Geology, 1960. William Henry Gilman, deceased, American Literature, 1960-1964. David Ginsberg, deceased, Chemistry, 1960. Frank Hindman Gale, deceased, Economics, 1960. Edward David Goldberg, Emeritus Professor of Chemistry, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, University of California. Frank Gonzalez, artist, Ross, California, 1960. Leonard Seymour Goodman, deceased, Physics, 1960. John Edward Graffius, deceased, Plant Science, 1960. Charles Richard Grau, Emeritus Professor of Avian Sciences, University of California, Davis, 1960. Moshe Greenberg, Emeritus Professor of the Bible, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, 1960. Joshua Greenfeld, writer, Pacific Palisades, California, 1960. Donald Redfield Griffin, Associate of Zoology in the Museum of Comparative Zoology, Harvard University, 1960. Dwayne Douglas Hagerman, deceased, Biochemistry, 1960. Robert Louis Haig, Jr., deceased, 18th Century English Literature, 1960. Maurice Hall, Institute Professor Emeritus, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1960. Paul Handler, deceased, Physics, 1960. Earl D. Hansen, deceased, Medicine, 1960. Morgan Harris, Professor Emeritus of Molecular and Cellular Biology, University of California. James P. Hartnett, Professor of Energy Engineering, University of Illinois at Chicago Circle, 1960. Vernon Judson Harward, Jr., deceased, Medieval Literature, 1960. J. Christopher Herold, deceased, French, 1960. Israel Nathan Herstein, deceased, Mathematics, 1960-1968. Robert Dixon Hill, research physicist, University of California, Santa Barbara, 1960. Elizabeth F. Hirsch, deceased, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, Trenton State College, 1960. Hans Albert Hochbaum, deceased, Writer-in-Residence, Delta Waterfowl Research Station, Manitoba, 1960. And Hitchcock Holmes, Critic at Large, Houston Chronicle, 1960. Judd D. Hubert, Professor Emeritus of French, University of California, Irvine, 1960. Ralph P. Hudson, physicist, Chevy Chase, Maryland, 1960. J. R. T. Hughes, deceased, Economics, 1960. William R. Hutchison, Charles Warren Professor of the History of Religion in America, Harvard University, 1960. George Gerson Eggers, Distinguished Professor of History, State University of New York at Buffalo, 1960. Leon Jacobs, Chairman of the Board and President, Borges Memorial Institute, Bethesda, Maryland, 1960. Hans Jaeger, deceased, German, 1960. Terry Walter Johnson, Jr., Reticle Professor Emeritus of Botany, Duke University, 1960. Harold Sledge Johnston, Professor Emeritus of Chemistry, University of California, Berkeley, 1960. George Hilton Jones, Roman III Professor Emeritus of History, Eastern Illinois University, 1960. John Paul Jones, deceased, Fine Art, 1960. Richard Victor Jones, Robert L. Wallace Professor of Applied Physics, Harvard University, 1960. J. R. Judson, William R. Kennan, Jr., Professor Emeritus of the History of Art, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, 1960. Robert Karplus, deceased, Physics, 1960-1973. Pieter Hendrik Keesum, deceased, Physics, 1960. Georgia Keeps, Institute Professor Emeritus and Professor Emeritus of Visual Design, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1960. Philip Kepler, Jr., deceased, Music Research, 1960. Joseph C. Kiger, Professor of History, University of Mississippi, 1960. Albert D. Kerwin, deceased, U.S. History, 1960. Walter David Knight, Professor Emeritus of Physics, University of California, Berkeley, 1960. Eno Edward Cree, William W. Corcoran, Professor Emeritus of History, University of Virginia, 1960. Alexander Jerry Crest, Professor of Chemistry, University of Toronto, 1960. Henry Q. Sura, deceased, Fred M. Seed, Professor Emeritus of Cognitive and Linguistic Sciences, Brown University, 1960. Paco Lagerstrom, deceased, Professor of Applied Mathematics, California Institute of Technology, 1960. Willis Eugene Lamb, Jr., Regents Professor of Physics and Optical Science, University of Arizona, 1960. Pearl Lang, choreographer, New York City, 1960-1969. John Raphael Lafnin, deceased, Biochemistry, Molecular Biology, 1960. Dan H. Lawrence, scholar, San Antonio, Texas, 1960, 1961, 1972. Ange Bultmann-Lemke, Professor Emerita of Library Science, School of Information Studies, Syracuse University, 1960. Marvin David Levy, composer, New York City, 1960-1964. Robert Murdoch Lewart, Professor Emeritus of Microbiology, University of Chicago, 1960. Arthur Lindenbaum, retired biochemist, New Braunfels, Texas, 1960. Seymour Lipton, deceased, Fine Arts Sculpture, 1960. Ralph Livingston, deceased, Chemistry, 1960. Daniel Archibald Livingstone, deceased, James B. Duke, Professor of Zoology and Geology, Duke University, 1960. Horace Grey-Lunt, Samuel Hazard Cross, Professor Emeritus of Slavic Languages and Literature, Harvard University, 1960. Clyde L. Manschreck, deceased. Harry and Hazel Javin, Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies, Rice University, 1960. Dylan Edward Mapler, Associate Vice Chancellor for Research and Associate Dean of the Graduate College, University of Illinois Champaign, 1960. Henry Margenau, deceased, Physics, 1960. John L. Margrave, E.D. Butcher, Professor of Chemistry and Vice President for Advanced Studies and Research, Rice University, 1960. Lester C. Mark, Professor Emeritus of Anesthesiology, College of Physicians and Surgeons, Columbia University, 1960. Julian B. Marsh, Visiting Scientist, USTA Human Nutrition Center, Tufts University, Professor Emeritus of Biochemistry, Medical College of Pennsylvania, 1960. Salvatore John Martirano, deceased, Music Composition, 1960. Max Smith Matheson, retired chemist, consultant, Downers Grove, Illinois, 1960. Thane H. McCullough, consultant, Petroleum Geoscience Consulting, Dallas, 1960. William Gerald McLaughlin, deceased, U.S. History, 1960. Gerald Mainwald, Goldwin Smith Professor of Chemistry, Cornell University, 1960, 1976. H. Hsien Changmeng, Professor Emeritus of Physiology, Vanderbilt University, 1960. Henry Cord Mayer, Professor Emeritus of History, University of California, Irvine, 1960. Ernest A. Michael, Professor of Mathematics, University of Washington, 1960. Agnes K. L. Mitchells, deceased, Classics, 1960. George C. Miles, deceased, Near Eastern Studies, 1960. John Preston Moore, deceased, Latin American Literature, 1960. Charles Wycliffe Moorman, Distinguished University Professor Emeritus and Vice President Emeritus of Academic Affairs, University of Southern Mississippi, 1960. Lincoln E. Moses, Emeritus Professor of Statistics, Stanford University, 1960. James Malcolm Moulton, deceased, Biology, 1960. Milton K. Munitz, deceased, Philosophy, 1960. John Charles Nelson, Professor Emeritus of Italian, Columbia University, 1960. William Stein Newman, deceased, Music Research, 1960. Theodore Burton Novy, transactional analyst instructor. Glenview, Illinois, 1960. Margaret Sinclair Ogden, deceased, Medieval Studies, 1960. Donald E. Osterbrock, Emeritus Professor of Astronomy and Astrophysics, University of California, Santa Cruz, 1960-1982. William Patchner, painter, Woodstock, New York, 1960-1960. Abraham Pies, deceased, physics, 1960. Hans Panofsky, deceased, astronomy, astrophysics, 1960. Vernon J. Parenton, deceased, sociology, 1960. Earl Randall Parker, deceased, engineering, 1960. Constantinos A. Patrides, deceased, 16th and 17th century English literature, 1960-1963. Reinhard G. Pauli, Professor Emeritus of Music, Lewis and Clark College, 1960-1960. Wilder Penfield, deceased, Medicine, 1960. Willis Bagley Person, Emeritus Professor of Chemistry, University of Florida, 1960. Carl Pfaffman, deceased, Psychology, 1960. John Letty Phelan, deceased, Spanish and Latin American History, 1960. Alan W. Phillips, Professor Emeritus of Spanish and Portuguese, University of California, Santa Barbara, 1960-1973. John Grissom Pierce, Professor Emeritus of Biological Chemistry, University of California, Los Angeles, 1960-1975. David H. Pinckney, deceased, French History, 1960. James N. Pitts, Jr., deceased, research chemist, University of California, Irvine, 1960. Ronald F. Probstein, Ford Professor of Mechanical Engineering, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1960. John Robert Raper, deceased, Biology, 1960. Henry H. Reed, Jr., writer, Curator of Central Park, New York City, 1960. Warren S. Reham, deceased, Biochemistry, Molecular Biology, 1960. Edgar Reich, deceased, Professor of Mathematics, University of Minnesota, 1960. Stanley Reiter, Morrison Professor of Economics, Mathematics and Management, Northwestern University, 1960. Millicent Barton Rex, deceased, British History, 1960. Lawrence H. Rhinelander, deceased, Law, 1960. George Warren Rickey, deceased, sculptor, East Chatham, New York, 1960-1961. Robert Edgar Riegel, deceased, U.S. History, 1960. David Mark Ritson, Professor of Physics, Stanford University, 1960. Alan L. Rogers, Professor of Geography, Pennsylvania State University, 1960. Hartley Rogers, Jr., Professor of Mathematics, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1960. Harold Emil Rorschach, Jr., deceased, Physics, 1960. Reinhard Mathies Rosenberg, deceased, Engineering, 1960. M. L. Rosenthal, deceased, Literary Criticism, 1960-1964. Archibald Frank Ross, deceased, Professor Emeritus of Plant Pathology, Cornell University, 1960. Arthur M. Ross, deceased, Economics, 1960. Jack Rousseau, deceased, Biology, Plant Science, 1960. Inez Scott Ryberg, deceased, Classics, 1960. Charles Richard Sanders, Professor Emeritus of English, Duke University, 1960-1972. William H. Saunders, Jr., Emeritus Professor of Chemistry, University of Rochester, 1960. Wolfgang Manfred Schubert, Professor Emeritus of Chemistry, University of Washington, 1960. Franz Sherman, Professor of History and of Sociology, University of California, Berkeley, 1960. Albert C. deceased, Music Research, 1960. Joachim Hans Sapel, writer, Berlin, 1960. George Gaylord Simpson, deceased, Earth Science, 1960. James Morton Smith, Director, Henry Francis DuPont Winterthur Museum, Winterthur, Delaware, 1960. William Overton Smith, Composer, Professor Emeritus of Music, University of Washington, 1960-1961, 61, 61, 61. Rolf Hans Solner, deceased, 16th and 17th century English literature, 1960. Waclaw J. Solsky, deceased, Russian history, 1960. Leo Harry Sommer, deceased, chemistry, 1962. Henry S. Somers, Jr., retired research physicist, Newton, Pennsylvania, 1960. David Derrick Stackton, deceased, fiction, 1960-1966. Wendell Meredith Stanley, deceased, biochemistry, 1960. Lloyd William Staples, Professor Emeritus of Geology, University of Oregon, 1960. Herbert Max Steiner, Professor of Physics, University of California, Berkeley, 1960. Peter O. Steiner, Emeritus Professor of Economics and Law and Emeritus Dean, College of Literature, Science and the Arts, University of Michigan, 1960. Edward Arthur Steinhaus, deceased, biochemistry, 1960. Lionel Stevenson, deceased, 19th century English literature, 1960. Francis Gordon Albert Stone, Robert A. Welch Distinguished Professor of Chemistry, Baylor University, Waco, Texas, 1960. Howard Coombs Stutz, deceased, Professor of Botany, Brigham Young University, 1960. Harvey Swadows, deceased, fiction, 1960. William A. Swanberg, deceased, biography, 1960. Nud George Swenson, deceased, biochemistry, 1960. William Harrison Telfer, Professor of Zoology, University of Pennsylvania, 1960. Mark J. Temmer, Professor of French, University of California, Santa Barbara, 1960. P. Emery Thomas, Professor of Mathematics, University of California, Berkeley, 1960. Virgil Thompson, deceased, Music Composition, 1960. Marion R. Tinling, historian, Sacramento, California, 1960. Frank Sargent Tompkins, deceased, consultant, Argonne National Laboratory, University of Chicago, 1960. Philip Trone, physician-in-chief emeritus, Montefiore Hospital, professor of medicine, University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, 1960. Herbert Henry Uhlig, deceased, chemistry, 1960. Morris Valency, deceased, literary criticism, 1960-1964. Robert Lawrence Vernier, professor emeritus of pediatrics and pathology, University of Minnesota Medical School, 1960. William Edgar Vinacki, professor emeritus of psychology, State University of New York at Buffalo, 1960. Richard Wagner, deceased, medicine, 1960. Franklin Dickerson Walker, deceased, American literature, 1960. H.C. Chung Wang, deceased, mathematics, 1960. Dewey H. Sin Wang, Einstein, professor of science, State University of New York at Buffalo, 1960-1972. Joseph Anthony Ward, Jr., professor of English, Rice University, 1960. Kurt Weinberg, professor emeritus of French, German, and comparative literature, University of Rochester, 1960. Stanley Newman Werbo, emeritus professor of Germanic languages, University of Texas at Austin, 1960. Bartlett Geer Whiting, deceased, medieval literature, 1960. William Cooper Wildman, deceased, chemistry, 1960. Thurman Wilkins, retired professor of English, Queens College, City University of New York, Bandon, Oregon, 1960. Richard Wilson, Mallinckrodt Research Professor of Physics, Harvard University, 1960-1968. Donald Wyndham, writer, New York City, 1960. Philip Finwold, deceased, Biochemistry, 1960. Ralph Stoner Wolfe, Professor Emeritus of Microbiology, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, 1960-1975. Elizabeth Wood, deceased, Architecture, 1960. Frank Nelson Young, Jr., Professor Emeritus of Zoology, Indiana University, 1960. Harold Zirin, Emeritus Professor of Astrophysics, California Institute of Technology, 1960. 1960 Latin American and Caribbean Fellows: Tomas Batista Encarnacion, artist, San Juan, Puerto Rico, 1960. Mario Davidovsky, composer, Boston, Massachusetts. MacDowell, Professor Emeritus of Music and Director, Electronic Music Center, Columbia University, 1960-1961. Raul Narciso de Santi, Professor of Geology, National University of the South, Bahia Blanca, 1962. Oscar Luis Gelmarini, Head, Honorary Professor Emeritus of Chemistry, University of Buenos Aires, 1960. Alercio Moreira Gomes, Professor of Applied Mathematics, Fluminense Federal University, Brazil, 1960. Armando T. Hunziker, Director, IMBIV Coinsit Univ. NAC. Cordoba, Director, Botanical Museum, National University of Cordoba, 1960-1978. Delfina E. Lopez Saralang, Research Historian, Institute of Historical Research, National Autonomous University of Mexico, 1960. Sergio Mascarenhas Oliveira, Professor of Physics and Director of the Instituto de Estudos Avancados, Universidade de São Paulo at São Carlos, 1960. Eustorgio Mendez, Head Department of Zoology, Gorgas Memorial Laboratory, Panama, 1960. Juan Roque Munizaga Villavicencio, RTO, Professor of Physical Anthropology, University of Chile, 1960. Guillermo R. J. Pillar, Professor of Biology, University of Connecticut, 1960-1962. Teresa Pinto Hamay, Professor of Physiology, University of Chile, 1960. Genaro O. Ranit, Retired Assistant Professor of Animal Husbandry, University of the Philippines at Los Banos, Laguna, International Poultry Expert, Poultry Research Institute, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Karachi, 1960, 1961. Alexander Augusto Martins Rodriguez, Professor of Mathematics, University of São Paulo, 1960. Andrew Salke, deceased, Folklore and Popular Culture, 1960. Bienvenido Santos, deceased, Fiction, 1960-60. Hugh Worrell Springer, deceased, Political Science, 1960. Gonzalo Zubieta Russi, Mathematician, Mexico, DF, 1960.